234 judges, 7 states, the largest judicial arrest in American history.
At 4:47 a.m., the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed the largest simultaneous judicial arrest operation in United States history. 234 judges, 7 states, every level of the American justice system, from traffic courts handling parking violations to the highest state Supreme Courts deciding constitutional questions. The number alone should terrify you, but here is what should keep you awake at night. This was not the work of a few bad actors. This was not opportunistic corruption spreading randomly through the system like mold through bread. According to federal prosecutors, what happened in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah over the past 11 years represents the most sophisticated, deliberate, and successful infiltration of American governmental institutions by a foreign criminal organization ever documented. The Sinaloa Cartel did not merely bribe judges, they built a shadow judicial system, and they ran it for over a decade while we trusted blindly in courtrooms that had already been purchased. If you think you understand how deep this goes, you do not yet. Because the judges were only the visible surface of something far more calculated, far more dangerous, and far more devastating than anyone outside the FBI's inner circle realized until this morning. Let me show you what really happened. The first raids began in darkness. At 4:32 a.m. Pacific Time, FBI tactical teams moved simultaneously across 14 locations in the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area. The night air hung thick with coastal fog, not the kind that muffles sound and swallows light. Street lamps glowed like dying embers through the haze. The city slept, unaware that beneath its dreams, a reckoning had finally arrived. Combined strike forces of FBI, DEA, and ICE agents, supported by SWAT teams and DHS tactical units, hit their targets with coordinated precision. They struck cartel-connected nightclubs in East Los Angeles, where backrooms served as cash-counting operations. They breached warehouse complexes in Commerce and Vernon that functioned as distribution hubs for methamphetamine and fentanyl moving north from Mexico. They descended on a seemingly abandoned industrial build in Pomona that concealed one of the largest drug superlabs ever discovered on California soil. The seizures in those first 90 minutes were staggering: 1,800 kilograms of cocaine, and 470 kilograms of methamphetamine, 2.1 million fentanyl pills, enough to kill every resident of Los Angeles twice over, $47 million in cash, bundled and shrink-wrapped and stacked in a basement vault like construction materials. But the drugs and money were not what made FBI agents pause in the pre-dawn darkness. It was what they found hidden behind a false wall in the Pomona Superlab: 12 encrypted hard drives, 3 secure servers, and a steel lockbox containing handwritten ledgers detailing payments, code names, case numbers, and judicial assignments stretching back 11 years. In that moment, federal agents realized they had not merely disrupted a drug operation. They had uncovered the financial nervous system of an organization that had systematically purchased American justice. The servers were transported under armed escort to the FBI's cyber forensics facility in downtown Los Angeles. By 6:15 a.m., a team of 17 federal analysts had begun the process of cracking military-grade encryption. By 8 a.m., they had their first complete file decryption. What appeared on their screens made seasoned investigators go silent. They were looking at a master organizational chart with a code name at the top: Project Themis, named with deliberate irony after the Greek goddess of justice. The chart showed a network spanning 7 states, 234 judicial positions, 47 shell companies, 16 offshore banking relationships, and a web of payment channels so complex it would take months to fully trace. At the center of the network sat a single name: our Chief Justice Harold McKenzie of the California Supreme Court. According to the decrypted files, Justice McKenzie, 63 years old, a former federal prosecutor with an impeccable reputation, a man who had been profiled admiringly in legal journals and mentioned as a potential nominee to the United States Supreme Court, had served for 9 years as the primary coordinator of the Sinaloa Cartel's judicial corruption operation across the American Southwest. The files showed everything: recruitment conversations, payment schedule, case assignments, instructions from cartel leadership transmitted through encrypted channels and translated into judicial action across thousands of criminal proceedings. Justice McKenzie had not merely accepted bribes, and he had architected a parallel justice system that answered not to the Constitution of the United States, but to the leadership of a Mexican drug cartel. And he had done it while wearing robes and wielding a gavel in the state's highest court. This is not corruption in any conventional sense. This is institutional capture. This is the colonization of American sovereignty by a criminal enterprise. This is what happens when drug profits grow so enormous that entire governmental systems become commodities to be purchased on the open market of power. The operation was just beginning. At 5 a.m. Mountain Time, a unified command center in Phoenix, Arizona activated what federal officials internally designated Operation Blind Justice. The irony of that name was not lost on anyone in the room. On massive screens covering the forward wall, a digital map displayed the 7 affected states. Across that map, 347 red markers pulsed like heartbeats, each representing a target location requiring simultaneous action. The operational commander, Deputy Director Angela Reeves of the FBI, addressed the assembled personnel. 1,200 federal agents, 48 SWAT teams, helicopter support, including 18 Black Hawk helicopters positioned across 3 states, naval assets including 2 Coast Guard cutters providing offshore interdiction support along the California coast, air assets including 2 F-15 fighter jets providing airspace security over the border region. The targets included not merely the 234 judges, but the entire support infrastructure of Project Themis, attorneys who had served as intermediaries, accountants who had laundered payments, property managers who had maintained safe houses, business owners whose legitimate enterprises had provided cover for cartel money movement. When Deputy Director Reeves gave the order, American law enforcement moved with a coordination and scale that matched anything seen in overseas military operations. Across California, teams struck in Los Angeles, San Diego, Fresno, Sacramento, and a dozen smaller jurisdictions. In Arizona, they hit Phoenix, Tucson, Yuma, and critical border zones where cartel logistics had been protected by corrupted courts. In Texas, operations unfolded across El Paso, Laredo, and the Rio Grande Valley, where judges had dismissed thousands of trafficking cases over the past decade. In New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah, similar operations proceeded simultaneously. The scope was unprecedented in domestic law enforcement history. At a mansion in Scottsdale, Arizona, FBI agents found a Superior Court judge attempting to flee with 2 suitcases containing $3 million in cash and encrypted communications devices. At a ranch outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, tactical teams discovered a county judge burning documents in a barrel fire behind his property. They recovered enough fragments to confirm payments exceeding $4 million over 7 years. In a gated community in Henderson, Nevada, an appellate judge surrendered peacefully, but his home revealed assets including 17 luxury vehicles, a private art collection valued at $12 million, and bank records showing transfers from shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Singapore. By 9 a.m. local time, across all 7 states, 187 of the 234 targeted judges were in federal custody. The remaining 47 were apprehended over the following 6 hours as they attempted to flee or were located at secondary residences. Not a single target escaped. The seizures from the judges alone exceeded preliminary estimates. 840 residential properties, over 200 commercial properties, 600 vehicles, including collections of exotic automobiles, 14 private aircraft, 23 boats and yachts, jewelry, artwork, and collectibles valued collectively at over $200 million, and bank accounts, both domestic and offshore, containing over $900 million. And these were not wealthy individuals who happened to have taken some questionable payments. These were employees of a criminal enterprise who had been compensated at executive levels for their services. But the judges, as devastating as their corruption was, represented only the most visible layer of what federal investigators had uncovered. As FBI forensic accountants worked through the seized servers and financial records, they mapped a corruption network that extended far beyond the courtroom. Within law enforcement agencies across the 7 states, the cartel had recruited personnel at every level. Border Patrol agents who received $10,000 per convoy of drugs they allowed to pass undetected, sheriff's deputies who provided advance warning of planned raids, police officers who shared patrol schedules and interdiction routes, evidence technicians who contaminated or lost critical materials, records clerks who altered documentation. The numbers were devastating. Across the 7 states, federal investigators identified 371 law enforcement personnel who had received cartel payments. This included 16 Sheriff's Department supervisors, 24 Police Department lieutenants and captains, 11 Border Patrol supervisors, and 7 state police commanders. In 3 counties in Arizona, the investigation revealed that cartel informants held positions in every major law enforcement agency operating in the region. They knew about planned operations before they happened. They knew which officers could be trusted and which could be approached. But they had transformed local law enforcement into an intelligence operation serving cartel interests. The honest officers who had served in these corrupted departments described their experience in terms that sounded like soldiers describing enemy occupation. They had suspected something was wrong. Cases that should have been solid fell apart. Criminals who should have been convicted walked free. Information seemed to leak before major operations, but they could not identify the source, could not prove what they suspected, could not trust their own colleagues with their concerns. One Phoenix detective who had served 22 years described finding out that his own sergeant had been on cartel payroll for 8 years. "I trusted that man with my life," the detective said. "I worked cases with him. I thought he was one of the good ones. Now I find out he was selling us out the whole time." How do you process that? Federal agents began arresting compromised law enforcement personnel simultaneously with the judicial arrests. By noon on February 1st, over 200 law enforcement officers were in federal custody, with more arrests expected as the investigation continued. But the corruption extended even further than law enforcement. The decrypted Project Themis files revealed that the cartel had recruited assets within state legislatures, county governments, and regulatory agencies across the 7 states. 17 state legislators had received payments to influence legislation affecting law enforcement funding, border security, and criminal justice policy. Their interventions were subtle but effective. Budget amendments that reduced funding for drug interdiction unit, regulatory changes that complicated evidence collection, personnel policies that made it harder to investigate corruption. County commissioners in border regions had accepted payments to approve permits for properties that served as cartel safe houses and distribution points. Building inspectors had been paid to overlook code violations at facilities used for drug processing. Tax officials had been compensated to minimize scrutiny of suspicious business operations. The cartel had not merely corrupted individuals within the system. They had learned to manipulate the system itself, using legitimate governmental processes to protect their illegitimate operations. This is what made Project Themis different from ordinary corruption. Ordinary corruption involves bad actors exploiting a good system. This was the systematic conversion of good systems into instruments of criminal enterprise. Now let me tell you about the scope of what this corruption protected. Over 11 years, federal investigators estimate that the judicial protection provided by Project Themis enabled the Sinaloa Cartel to move approximately 400,000 kilograms of cocaine, 300,000 kilograms of methamphetamine, 150,000 kilograms of heroin, and over 800 million fentanyl pills through the 7 affected states. The street value of these drugs exceeds $250 billion. The human cost is measured differently. Federal health authorities estimate that drugs protected by this corruption network contributed to over 90,000 overdose deaths across the United States. 90,000 families destroyed, 90,000 futures erased, 90,000 human beings whose lives ended because a foreign criminal organization had purchased the institutions designed to protect them. But the drugs were only part of what the corrupted judicial system protected. The same network facilitated human trafficking operations that moved an estimated 40,000 individuals through the 7 states over the 11-year period. Migrant smuggling operations that generated billions in additional cartel revenue. Money laundering operations that cleaned an estimated $120 billion in criminal proceeds through American financial system. The corrupted judges did not merely dismiss drug cases. They dismissed human trafficking cases where victims had been identified and evidence collected. They released defendants in smuggling operations who promptly returned to moving human beings across the border. They approved custody arrangements that placed children with cartel-connected handlers. They issued rulings that made it nearly impossible to prosecute money laundering operations within their jurisdictions. The files recovered from Project Themis included case numbers, over 26,000 specific instances where corrupted judges made decisions that benefited cartel interests. Some were dramatic interventions in major trafficking prosecutions. Others were minor actions, a traffic violation dismissed here, an evidence ruling there. It accumulated across thousands of proceedings to create an environment where cartel operations faced minimal legal risk. And at the center of it all sat Justice Harold McKenzie. According to federal prosecutors, McKenzie was recruited by the Sinaloa Cartel in 2015. When he was serving as a Superior Court judge in San Diego County, he had significant gambling debts, a lifestyle that exceeded his judicial salary, and a reputation for being susceptible to influence. The initial payment was $2 million, delivered through a shell company that appeared to be compensating him for legitimate consulting work. In exchange, McKenzie agreed to make favorable rulings in cases involving cartel defendants and to identify other judges who might be susceptible to recruitment. Over the following 9 years, McKenzie received total payments exceeding $65 million. He rose to the California Supreme Court while serving as the primary coordinator of Project Themis, using his position and reputation to recruit judges across 7 states and ensure their coordination with cartel interests. The encrypted files revealed communications between McKenzie and cartel leadership discussing strategy, identifying recruitment targets, and coordinating responses to law enforcement initiatives. He had regular contact with individuals the DEA has identified as senior Sinaloa Cartel figures. He received instructions about priorities and transmitted them to the network of corrupted judges under his coordination. Justice McKenzie did not merely sell out American justice. He managed its systematic betrayal as a professional enterprise. When FBI agents arrived at his home in Pacific Palisades at 4:45 a.m. on February 1st, McKenzie was awake and waiting. According to agents present, he appeared calm, almost resigned. He asked only one question before being taken to custody. "How long have you known?" The answer is complicated. Federal investigators had suspected judicial corruption related to cartel operations for years. But the scope of Project Themis remained hidden until a series of intelligence breaks in 2023 provided entry points into the network. Even then, the investigation required 2 more years to map the full extent of the corruption and build cases against all 234 judges. The operational security of the investigation was extreme. Not fewer than 50 people within the entire federal government knew the full scope of what was being investigated. Wiretaps were authorized at the highest levels and compartmentalized to prevent any possibility of warning reaching the targets. When the operation finally executed, it represented the culmination of one of the most complex, sensitive, and consequential investigations in FBI history. But now comes the hardest question. What happens next? 234 judges must be replaced while maintaining functioning court systems across 7 states. The California Supreme Court alone lost its Chief Justice and 2 Associate Justices to arrest. Appellate courts across the affected states lost dozens of judges. Trial courts in critical border regions lost majorities of their benches. The Department of Justice has established emergency protocols, bringing retired federal judges out of retirement, arranging for judges from unaffected states to provide temporary coverage, expediting judicial appointments at every level. But the damage cannot be undone by personnel changes alone. Over 26,000 cases must be reviewed for potential corruption. Convictions that may have been legitimate must be distinguished from convictions that resulted from honest judicial processes. Cases that were improperly dismissed must be evaluated for potential re-prosecution. Though, in many instances, statutes of limitations have expired or evidence has been lost. Families who lost loved ones to overdoses now know that the drugs that killed them moved through a region where justice had been purchased. But victims of human trafficking now know that their suffering was extended because corrupted judges released their traffickers. Communities that watched drug violence destroy their neighborhoods now understand that the institutions supposedly protecting them were working for the other side. There is no prosecutorial action that can restore what was taken from them. The defendants in Project Themis face charges that could result in sentences ranging from 20 years to life in federal prison. Justice McKenzie, as the primary coordinator, faces a potential sentence of life imprisonment without parole. The 233 other judges face sentences calibrated to their levels of involvement, with most expected to receive terms between 15 and 40 years. None of them will ever wear robes again. None of them will ever claim the title of justice again. But their punishment, however severe, cannot undo what they enabled. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us with questions that have no comfortable answers. It leaves us asking how the most sophisticated oversight systems ever created for judicial accountability failed to detect systematic corruption involving 8% of all judges in 7 states. It leaves us asking how legitimate law enforcement efforts across more than a decade were undermined by corrupted courts without anyone identifying the pattern. It leaves us asking whether other institutions we trust have been similarly compromised, whether other systems we depend upon have been quietly converted into instruments of criminal enterprise. And it leaves us understanding something that should have been obvious long ago. The profits generated by illegal drug trafficking are so enormous, so concentrated, and so mobile that they can purchase almost anything. Judges, law enforcement, legislators, systems, institutions, the very mechanisms we created to protect ourselves. As long as drug trafficking generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually, criminal organizations will have resources sufficient to corrupt any institution they choose to target. The Sinaloa Cartel spent approximately $1.8 billion over 11 years to purchase judicial protection. That investment protected operations generating over $200 billion in revenue. From a business perspective, corrupting American judicial systems offered a return on investment that would be the envy of any legitimate enterprise. And until we address the fundamental economics that make such investments rational, we will face this threat again and again. Power does not always need violence to establish itself. Sometimes it only needs money, patience, and the willingness to exploit systems that were built on trust. The 234 judges arrested this morning violated that trust in exchange for payments that seemed enormous to them, but represented pennies on the dollar for the organization that employed them. They were not masterminds. They were employees of an enterprise that understood American institutions better than many Americans do. And now, we must rebuild what they sold. We must restore faith in courtrooms where faith was betrayed. We must convince Americans that justice is not for sale, even though we just proved that it was, for 11 years, across 7 states, affecting thousands of lives. That is the task ahead. And it will not be completed with arrests and prosecutions alone. It will require a reckoning with how we arrived here, with the systems that failed, with the oversight that was absent, with the assumptions that proved catastrophic. This story is a fictional dramatization of issues that are very real. But the questions it raises deserve answers. If you are still watching, tap like so more people see this story. Comment justice if you believe accountability must extend beyond the courtroom. Share this so that the conversation continues, because silence is how these systems survive. And sunlight is the only disinfectant that works. Thank you for watching.